Millionaire marries the maid by contract, discovers she's a virgin, and falls deeply in love. The sound of Rachel Bennett's heels echoed through the corridors of the 45th floor of Bradford Technologies as she marched towards the CEO's office, carrying a pile of documents that could determine the future of the company. As head of the legal department, she knew that the news she was about to deliver would cause an earthquake in James Bradford's life. "Mr. Bradford, we've found something in the company's bylaws that requires your immediate attention." Rachel placed the documents on the glass table of the executive, who was engrossed in his laptop. "It's about the succession clause." James raised his ice blue eyes from the screen, his impassive expression masking his irritation at the interruption. At 34, he had transformed the family business into a technological powerhouse worth billions of dollars, but his impeccable appearance, tailored suit, and meticulously straightened brown hair didn't reveal the sleepless nights devoted to the empire he had built. "What clause?" His deep voice carried a tone of impatience. "According to the original document signed by your grandfather in 1952, only married men can occupy the presidency of the board. You have 3 months to comply, or you'll have to resign." The silence that followed was thick enough to be cut with a knife. James stood up, slowly walking over to the glass wall that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. His reflection showed a man whose absolute control over everything was about to slip through his fingers. "How long do you think we need to change this clause?" he asked without turning around. 6 months minimum. And we'd need the unanimous approval of the board." "Impossible. Harrison and Matthews would do anything to bring me down." James turned to Rachel, his calculating eyes already devising a solution. "How long until the next council meeting?" 2 weeks. It was at that moment that Maria Santos, his executive assistant for 5 years, entered the room, carrying the day's agenda. James watched as the 25-year-old Brazilian methodically organized the appointments on her desk. There was something about her quiet efficiency that always impressed him. "Maria, cancel my appointments for this afternoon." "Rachel, draw up a marriage contract. The strictest one you can draw up." The two women exchanged confused glances, but it was Rachel who verbalized the question. "Pardon, a commercial marriage contract. 2 years long, $5 million as final compensation, and the most restrictive clauses you can imagine." James turned his attention to Maria. "Miss Santos, I'd like to talk to you in private." Rachel left the room, and Maria remained standing, her delicate hands holding the clipboard against her chest like a shield. James noticed, not for the first time, how she maintained an elegant posture even under pressure. "Maria, I need your help with a delicate situation." He gestured for her to sit down. "You know my life, my routine, and most importantly, you know this company. I have to get married in the next 2 weeks, and I'm proposing a business deal." Maria's brown eyes widened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "A business arrangement, sir, yes. A marriage of convenience, lasting 2 years. You will receive $5 million at the end of the contract, plus a substantial monthly salary for the duration. In return, you will keep up appearances at social events and sign a confidentiality agreement." Maria took a deep breath, her fingers tightening imperceptibly on the clipboard. "Why me?" "Because you're a discreet professional and know how this world works. Besides," he paused, calculating, "I believe the amount offered would be useful to help your family in Brazil." The comment hit Maria like a straight arrow. Less than a month ago, she had casually mentioned her parents' predicament following the bankruptcy of their small restaurant in Sao Paulo. James noticed the subtle change in her expression and knew he had hit the right note. "You would have to change your name legally for the marriage register. Maria Santos would become Emma Santos, something more suitable for a social circle." The young woman nodded mechanically, her mind processing the surreal proposal. "How long do I have to decide?" "Until tomorrow morning. The contract will be ready for your review in a few hours." James sat back down, indicating that the conversation was over. "Oh, and Maria, that's between us." After she left, James allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The solution was perfect: a competent employee with no known romantic ties and a financial need that would motivate her to accept the deal. There were no emotional risks involved, it was just a business transaction. What James didn't know was that night in her small apartment in Queens, Maria, now about to become Emma, would cry for hours not at the proposal itself, but at the fact that the man she had secretly admired for years saw her only as a convenient solution to his problem. The next morning, when she entered the office with her positive response, James Bradford had no idea that his perfectly calculated plan was about to trigger a series of events that would completely transform his life. The contract that he considered to be emotion-proof would only be the beginning of a story that neither of them had planned to live. The morning after the proposal, Emma, still getting used to her new name, stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of the small apartment in Queens. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied her nude lipstick, a gift her mother had sent her from Brazil last Christmas. The irony didn't escape her. She was putting on makeup to sign a contract that would change her life completely. Her cell phone vibrated on the bathroom counter. It was a message from her mother. "Daughter, did you manage to send any money this month?" Emma closed her eyes, remembering the pile of her father's medical bills that her mother had shown her on the last video call. The decision to accept James Bradford's offer no longer seemed so difficult in this light. Arriving at Bradford Technologies, Emma found Rachel Bennett waiting in her cubicle holding a thick black folder. "Miss Santos, I need you to review these documents before the meeting with Mr. Bradford at 9 a.m. Emma nodded, taking the folder with a professionalism that masked her nervousness. As she opened the contract, her eyebrows rose at the meticulously detailed clauses sharing a resident's coordinated public appearances protocols for social events, and even guidelines on how they should interact in public. "5 minutes, Miss Santos." James' voice sounded through the intercom on his desk, making his heart leap. Inside James' office, the atmosphere seemed even more intimidating than usual. He was standing by the window, talking on the phone in a low, authoritative tone. His reflection in the glass showed a tense expression that Emma had rarely seen. "Sit down," he gestured to her after ending the call. "Have you reviewed the contract?" "Yes, sir." Emma settled into her chair, maintaining the upright posture her mother had always insisted was important. "I have some concerns." James raised an eyebrow, a gesture she had seen countless times during important meetings. "Go on." "The clause about sharing a residence." "My apartment, it's already been sorted out," he interrupted her. "I bought an apartment on the Upper East Side. 3 bedrooms, view of Central Park. You're moving in today." Emma blinked, surprised at the speed of the changes. "Today, we need to establish our story before the board meeting. 2 weeks isn't much time to create a convincing narrative." James slid a black credit card across the table. "Use this to buy a proper closet. Rachel will provide a personal shopper." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of signatures and instructions. Emma found herself being driven by Rachel to an exclusive boutique on Madison Avenue, where a woman called Charlotte with a critical eye and a British accent set about transforming her into what she called a proper Bradford. "The hair," Charlotte muttered, circling Emma like an elegant vulture, "needs changing. I'll make an appointment with Frederick. He does the Victoria Beckham." For hours later, Emma barely recognized her reflection. Her hair, once dark brown and long, now sported a lighter shade and a modern cut that framed her face. Her modest work clothes had been replaced by designer pieces that cost more than her monthly rent. When she arrived at her new apartment in the late afternoon, accompanied by an efficient moving team, Emma felt the weight of reality. The place was stunning with elegant furniture and a breathtaking view, but it felt as impersonal as James' office. "Your room is on the right." James appeared in the doorway, his tie already loosened after a long day. "Mine's at the end of the corridor. We'll keep up appearances, but respect each other's privacy." Emma nodded, noticing how he avoided looking directly at her transformation. "Thank you, Mr. Bradford." "James," he corrected, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of discomfort. "You need to call me James now." And he hesitated. The transformation was appropriate. That night, alone in her luxurious new room, Emma finally allowed the tears to fall. They weren't tears of sadness or regret, but of an emotion she couldn't name. In less than 48 hours, she had gone from being Maria Santos, the discreet executive assistant, to Emma Santos, the future wife of one of the most powerful men in New York. Her phone vibrated with a new message from James. "Dinner with the board tomorrow. 19H. Driver will pass at 630. With a green dress, Charlotte sorted. Emma replied with a simple "okay," but her fingers hovered over the keyboard, wanting to say more. Wanting to ask if he was as frightened as she was by the speed of change, if he also felt the weight of expectations, if at some point he had considered that she might be more than a convenient solution to his problem. Across the hall, James stared at the same message on his cell phone, fighting an uncomfortable feeling of guilt as he saw Emma's profile picture, still the old Maria, smiling shyly at some corporate event. He had calculated every aspect of this arrangement except what it would be like to share his life, however superficially, with someone who knew every detail of his routine, every habit, every moment of weakness that he tried to hide from the world. The sound of soft music coming from her room surprised him. It was a Brazilian melody, something melancholy and beautiful that he didn't understand, but which somehow perfectly captured the moment of transition they were experiencing. James closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment of doubt about what had begun. Tomorrow they would face the first test of their elaborate farce, and he could only hope that Emma's transformation would go beyond appearance, that she could truly become the partner he needed to maintain his empire. What James didn't know was that Emma was already much more than he imagined, and that her true transformation had nothing to do with expensive clothes or trendy haircuts. It was an inner metamorphosis that had begun long before that contract, the moment she first saw beyond the facade of the ruthless CEO and discovered the man he had tried so hard to hide. Le Bernardin sparkled like a jewel in nighttime Manhattan as Emma tried to control her breathing inside the limousine. The emerald green Valentino dress hugged her curves elegantly, but it was the diamond necklace James had sent earlier that seemed to weigh a ton on her neck. "Breathe normally," James murmured next to her, adjusting the platinum watch on her wrist. "Remember what we rehearsed? We met 6 months ago in an art gallery in Soho." Emma nodded, mentally reciting the fabricated story they had constructed during the afternoon. The official version of their romance included chance encounters at cultural events, conversations about modern art, and a spontaneous marriage proposal during a weekend trip to the Hamptons. Mr. Bradford, Harrison Matthews, one of the oldest members of the board, greeted them at the entrance to the restaurant. His blue-gray eyes studied Emma with barely disguised interest. "And this must be the mysterious bride, Emma Santos," she introduced herself with a controlled smile, extending her hand as Rachel had instructed, not too firm, not too delicate. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Matthews." James placed his hand on the small of Emma's back, a gesture that seemed natural to observers but sent shivers down her spine. They were led into a private room where other council members were already waiting with their wives. "James, you old fox," Catherine Whitman, a 60-year-old socialite married to the vice president of the council, approached them. "Why have you kept this jewel from us for so long?" "Some treasures are worth keeping," James replied softly, surprising Emma with the ease of his lie. "Emma prefers discretion." Over dinner, Emma discovered that years of observing James at meetings had taught her more than she had imagined. She navigated deftly between conversations about art, politics, and philanthropy, making insightful comments at just the right moments and maintaining an air of sophisticated reserve that seemed to charm everyone. "Where did you go to school, dear?" asked Sarah Matthews, Harrison's wife. "Brown," Emma replied without hesitation, following the established script. "Art history and business administration." James watched her performance with a mixture of approval and something else he couldn't quite identify. There was a natural gracefulness about Emma that no amount of training could have created, an authenticity that shone through the carefully constructed facade. The critical moment came during dessert when Harrison decided to test the waters. "So Emma, tell us how James proposed." Emma blushed slightly, a natural flush that added credibility to her story. "It was a Sunday morning in the Hamptons." She began, her eyes meeting James with a rehearsed softness. James had organized a breakfast on the beach. He seemed nervous, something rare for anyone who knows him well. James felt a tightness in his chest as he noticed how she incorporated details he himself had unwittingly shared over the years, his habit of drumming his fingers when anxious, his preference for quiet mornings on the beach. "He had scattered photos of us in the sand," Emma continued, her voice carrying an emotion that sounded all too genuine. "Each one marking an important moment in our relationship. The last photo was an empty space with a small black velvet box." The women at the table sighed with delight while the men exchanged approving glances. James realized that his fiancée had just won over the council with a story that perfectly blended romance and discretion. Later in the car, on the way home, a comfortable silence settled between them. Emma was distractedly playing with her diamond necklace, lost in thought. "You were impressive tonight." James commented, surprising them both with a spontaneous compliment. "I learned from the best," she replied softly, a ghost of a smile on her lips. When they arrived at the apartment, James followed her to her bedroom door, seeming to want to say something more. Emma waited, her heart racing inexplicably. "The necklace," he finally said, "was my mother's. She always said it should be worn by someone who understood its value beyond diamonds." Emma touched the stones with renewed reverence, realizing the weight of the gesture. "I didn't know." "No one knows," James admitted, his voice softer than usual. "Just as no one, but you knows that I really prefer mornings on the beach." Their gazes met in a moment of mutual understanding. Behind the carefully constructed masks, there were fragments of truth intertwining with the fiction they had created. "Good night, Emma," James finally said, turning towards his own room. "Good night, James." Closing the door, Emma leaned against it and closed her eyes. The line between reality and acting was beginning to blur dangerously. In his room, James stared at the illuminated city through the window, wondering when his efficient assistant had become so adept at reading his unspoken truths. What neither of them realized that night was that while building a fictional love story for the world, they were inadvertently writing their own chapter one that no contract could have predicted or controlled. The wedding dress seemed to weigh a ton as Emma stood in the atelier of renowned designer Vera Wang. The civil ceremony was only 3 days away, but James had insisted on a small reception to keep up appearances, and small in the Bradford's vocabulary meant 200 carefully selected guests. "You look absolutely stunning," sighed Charlotte, the personal shopper, adjusting the train of her dress. "James will lose his breath." Emma forced a smile, watching her reflection in the mirror. The dress was a dream in French lace and silk with a discreet neckline that revealed her delicate shoulders. Her new hair, now a lighter shade, imperfectly styled, completed her transformation from executive assistant to the bride of a billionaire. Speaking of the groom, Charlotte checked her watch. He should have been here 10 minutes ago to approve the outfit. As if summoned by her words, James entered the studio, interrupting a cell phone call. His eyes met Emma's in the mirror, and for a moment he seemed to lose the thread of his thoughts. The silence that followed was charged with something indefinable. "Perfect," he finally said, his voice huskier than usual. "Exactly what I imagined." Emma felt her heart race under his intense gaze. Over the last few days, since the dinner with the council, something had subtly changed between them. The mask occasionally slipped, revealing flashes of vulnerability that neither of them was prepared to face. "We need to discuss the vows," James commented as Emma changed behind the screen. Rachel suggested something traditional, but with a personal touch. "I have some ideas," Emma replied, emerging now in a much simpler navy blue dress. "Based on the stories we've created." They left the atelier and headed to a discreet cafe nearby, where they could discuss the final details of the wedding away from prying years. The place was cozy, with dark wooden tables and soft lighting, the kind of environment Emma frequented before her transformation. "You look more comfortable here," James observed, surprising her with his perception. "Places like this remind me of my parents' cafe in Sao Paulo," she admitted, allowing herself a moment of nostalgia. It was small but always full of life and laughter. James studied her over his cup of espresso. "You never told me what your life was like in Brazil." "You never asked," she replied softly, without accusation. A flash of guilt crossed his face. "I suppose there's a lot I don't know about you even after 5 years." "There's a lot no one knows," Emma smiled slightly. "Like the fact that I still have nightmares about the day our cafe caught fire. I was 19, and it was the first time I saw my father cry." James reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing hers on the table. The gesture, apparently to keep up appearances in case anyone was watching, carried a genuine comfort that took them both by surprise. "Is that why you accepted the deal?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Emma hesitated, considering her answer. "Partly, but also because..." She paused, biting her lip. Because I believe you're more than the world sees, James. Even if you try to hide it." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Rachel, carrying a folder with the last documents that needed to be signed before the ceremony. Emma quickly withdrew her hand, missing the warmth of his fingers. "The invitations have all been sent out," Rachel informed, spreading papers out on the table. "The press has been carefully selected. The story of the discreet romance is circulating in the right circles? As Rachel detailed the preparations, Emma noticed James watching her with a thoughtful expression. There was something different in his gaze, a mixture of curiosity and something deeper that she couldn't decipher. Back at the apartment later that evening, Emma found a small box on her bed. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet with a single pendant, a small rose gold coffee cup. The card that accompanied it said, "Only for new beginnings and old memories." Emma held the bracelet against her chest, feeling unexpected tears burn her eyes. The gesture revealed a side of James that she had always known existed, hidden under layers of protection built up over the years. Across the hall, James stared out at the night city through his bedroom window, absent-mindedly twirling his father's ring on his finger. The soft sound of Brazilian music floated through the apartment again, but this time, instead of melancholy, there was a note of hope in the melody. He picked up a cell phone, hesitated for a moment, then typed in a message. "Does the bracelet match tomorrow's dress?" The reply came almost instantly, perfectly. "How did you know?" "I pay attention," he replied, surprising himself with the honesty of the statement. In their respective rooms, separated by a wall and years of carefully constructed barriers, they both realized that they were dancing a dangerous waltz between reality and pretension, where every step brought them closer to a truth that no contract could predict or control. The morning of the wedding rehearsal dawned with a soft drizzle over Manhattan, creating an ethereal glow on the apartment's windows. Emma woke before the alarm, her fingers unconsciously searching for the bracelet James had given her. The coffee cup-shaped pendant caught the diffused light, reminding her that the line between reality and performance was becoming increasingly blurred. Ms. Santos, the voice of Parker, the new personal assistant hired to keep up appearances, sounded through the door. "Mr. Bradford asked me to remind you the rehearsal starts at 10 a.m. at St. Patrick's Cathedral." Emma felt her stomach turn. The choice of the historic cathedral had been Rachel's idea. "Nothing says true love like a traditional ceremony," she had argued. The fact that it would only be an elaborate reenactment for the real civil ceremony the next day didn't lessen the weight of the moment. While getting ready, Emma found a new Channel outfit on her bed, a cream tailcoat with gold detailing that matched perfectly with the bracelet. A note accompanied the outfit for rehearsal. Charlotte approved. In the elevator going down to meet the limousine, Emma was surprised by James getting in at the last second. He was impeccable in a navy blue suit, his familiar perfume filling the confined space. "Sleep well?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection of the elevator doors. "Yes." She lied, conscious of the dark circles under her eyes that she had carefully covered with concealer. "And you work late?" he observed, ignoring her question. "I'll listen to Brazilian music until after midnight." Emma blushed slightly. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "You didn't," James interrupted her gently. "Actually, it's comforting. It reminds you that there's life beyond contracts and meetings." The comment caught Emma off guard. Before she could reply, the elevator doors opened, revealing Rachel and a team of advisors waiting in a lobby. St. Patrick's Cathedral was surprisingly quiet that morning, with only the wedding team and a few scattered tourists. Father Johnson, a gray-haired gentleman with a kind smile, was waiting for them on the steps. "Are the young couple?" he exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "Shall we start with the basic positions?" For the next hour, Emma and James rehearsed every movement of the ceremony. How to walk, where to stop, how to exchange rings. Each gesture carefully choreographed to look natural and romantic. Now the priest smiled. "Let's practice the moment of the kiss." Emma felt her heart stop. This was a detail they surprisingly hadn't discussed. James also looked momentarily disconcerted, something rare in his usual composure. "Maybe we can skip that part today," Rachel suggested, noticing his discomfort. "Nonsense," the priest laughed. "It's just a rehearsal, children. Besides, you've probably done this 1,000 times before." James stepped forward, his eyes meeting Emma's with a silent question. She nodded, almost imperceptibly, her heart thundering against her ribs. The kiss was soft, controlled, professional, exactly as it should be. But something in the way James' fingers trembled slightly as they touched her cheek, wherein the almost inaudible sigh that escaped Emma's lips betrayed a truth they were both trying to ignore. "Perfect," the priest applauded, oblivious to the electric tension that had built up between them. "Now shall we go over the vows?" The rest of the rehearsal passed in a blur of instructions and adjustments. Emma barely registered the words. She was repeating her mind, still caught up in a moment of the kiss, the feel of James' lips on hers, the warmth of his hand on her waist. Later during lunch with the wedding team at a nearby restaurant, Emma noticed James watching her with a different intensity. There was something in his gaze that went beyond the calculated professionalism of recent days. "Your mother's ring," he said softly when they had a moment alone, "matches your eyes." Emma unconsciously touched the engagement ring. He had given her a vintage piece with a delicate pink diamond. "You never told me about her." "Maybe." James hesitated, adjusting his tie in a nervous gesture that Emma recognized from years of observation. "Maybe we can talk about it tonight. About our families, our histories. If we want this to be convincing tomorrow." Of course, Emma agreed, ignoring the tightness in her chest as she remembered that it was all just an elaborate performance. To make it more convincing, that evening, sitting on the balcony of the apartment with glasses of wine and the city shimmering below them, James and Emma began to share pieces of their lives that they had kept locked away. Stories of lost dreams, fears, and hopes that, without realizing it, were weaving into something much more real than any contract could have predicted. And as the night wore on, neither wanted to admit that that morning's rehearsal had been more than just practice. It had been a glimpse of something they were both secretly beginning to wish was real. The civil ceremony at Manhattan City Hall went off with the clinical efficiency that James so appreciated in his business dealings. Emma, wearing an elegant white Chanel ensemble, signed the documents with surprisingly steady hands, while James maintained his usual controlled expression. Rachel and the corporate lawyers served as witnesses, completing the perfectly orchestrated facade. It was during the small reception at St. Patrick's Cathedral hours later that the first cracks began to appear in their carefully constructed armor. "You look beautiful," whispered Catherine Whitman, adjusting Emma's veil before they entered the church. And James, "Well, I've never seen him look at someone like that before." Emma swallowed her hands, clenching the bouquet of white orchids. The music began to play, and the majestic doors opened. James was waiting for her at the altar, and something in his posture shifted subtly when their gazes met. Parker, now officially the best man, had commented earlier that James had spent the whole morning at the office, something unusual even by his workaholic standards. What no one knew was that he had been rewriting his vows dozens of times, struggling to find words that rang true without revealing too much. "Emma," James began, his voice huskier than usual, "when you came into my life." He paused, and Emma realized that he had abandoned his rehearsed vows. "You brought order to the chaos, not just to my schedule, but in my existence. You see beyond the masks I wear, beyond titles and expectations. And for that," his voice faltered slightly, "I promise to try to be the man you already see in me." A collective sigh echoed through the cathedral. Emma felt genuine tears burn her eyes, because in James' words there was a truth that transcended their business agreement. "James," she replied, her voice trembling slightly, "you gave me more than a contract or an opportunity. You gave me confidence when I doubted, strength when I faltered, and a purpose beyond my own dreams. I promise to be not only the partner you need, but the person who believes unconditionally in who you are." The kiss that sealed their vows was different from the rehearsal. There was a contained urgency and unspoken truth that made Emma's heart race and James' hands tremble slightly around her waist. During the reception of the Plaza Hotel, as they danced their first waltz as husband and wife, James held Emma closer than necessary. Her perfume, a mixture of jasmine and something uniquely his own, made him question every decision that had brought him there. "Your vows," Emma murmured against his shoulder, "weren't the ones we rehearsed." "Not yours either," he replied, his fingers tracing unconscious circles on her back. "Why?" James hesitated, turning her gently to the music. "Because enough lies have been told today." The confession hung between them, heavy with implications that neither of them was prepared to explore. They were interrupted by Harrison Matthews, who insisted on a dance with the bride. Later, as the reception began to wind down, James found Emma on the hotel balcony, gazing out over the city that never sleeps. She had removed her high-heeled shoes, and something about this small gesture of vulnerability touched him deeply. "Our flight to Paris leaves in 3 hours," he commented, offering her a glass of champagne. "We have time to change and—" "Paris?" Emma turned around in surprise. "I thought we were going straight to the meeting in London." I changed my plans, James admitted, looking away. I thought, well, if we're going to keep up appearances, a honeymoon in Paris seems appropriate. Emma studied his profile for a moment, noticing the tension in his jaw, a sign she knew well from her years as his assistant. James, what are you telling me? The presidential suite at the Ritz, he said after a moment. That's where my parents spent their honeymoon. Before everything, before the accident. The silence that followed was filled with understanding. Emma knew from years of organizing his schedule that James never visited Paris on the anniversary of the accident that had taken his parents' lives. That he chose just that hotel, that suite for their fake honeymoon, said more than any wedding vow could express. Thank you, she said simply, her hand finding his on the balcony ledge. For what? For trusting me with your truths. James intertwined his fingers with hers, a gesture that was supposed to be just to keep up appearances, but which carried a weight of intimacy that no contract could foresee. 3 hours later, as the private jet took off for Paris, Emma pretended to sleep so as not to have to deal with the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to overflow. James, on the other side of the aisle, pretended to work on his laptop, but his eyes kept returning to the ring on his finger, the same ring his father had worn for 30 years of real marriage. What neither of them realized was that as New York fell behind, they were carrying more than suitcases and business documents. They were carrying the weight of half-told truths and unacknowledged feelings that under the romantic skies of Paris might finally find their voice. The Ritz Paris rose majestically before them, its golden lights reflecting off the wet asphalt of Place Vado. Emma watched James present their IDs to the concierge with his usual efficiency, but noticed a subtle tension in his shoulders that few would notice. Monsieur and Madame Bradford, welcome. The clerk smiled, handing them the key cards for the presidential suite. I hope you find everything comme il faut. The private elevator took them in silence to the top floor. Emma felt the weight of the moment, not just because she was in Paris as the new Madame Bradford, but because she knew the emotional significance that this particular suite carried for James. When the doors opened directly into the suite, Emma held her breath. The space was stunning, with a panoramic view of the city of light and decor that blended classic French elegance with modern comfort. But it was a framed photograph on the wall that captured her attention, a young couple smiling in front of the hotel some 30 years ago. My parents, James explained softly, stepping closer. The hotel keeps photos of distinguished guests. They spent 2 weeks here before the accident, Emma finished when her voice failed her. She knew the story from the company archives, the helicopter that crashed during a business trip, leaving James an orphan at the age of 12. I never went back to Paris after that, he admitted, pouring himself a shot of whiskey from the suite's bar. It seemed inappropriate. Why now? James contemplated the amber liquid in his glass for a moment. Maybe it's time to create new memories. Even if he hesitated, even if it's part of an agreement, Emma felt her heart squeeze. Over the last few days, it had been easy to forget that everything was just an elaborate contract. The intimacy they had developed, the shared truths, the moments of vulnerability, it was all part of a carefully constructed performance. The meeting with the investors is tomorrow at 10, she commented, trying to return to the safe territory of professionalism. Should I ask for breakfast in the room? Emma, James interrupted her, his voice carrying a note of frustration. You don't need to be my assistant here. Then what should I be? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. James approached, stopping just a few steps away from her. Be yourself. The woman who knows my truths without me having to say them. The distant sound of music floated through the French windows, probably from some cafe nearby. Emma recognized the notes of La Vie en Rose and smiled slightly. Did your parents dance to that song here? How did you? James looked surprised. I saw the playlist on your phone. It was the only French song saved. He held out his hand in silent invitation. Emma hesitated only for a moment before accepting. Their bodies came together naturally, as if they had danced together hundreds of times before. My mother used to sing that, James murmured against her hair. She used to say that Paris had the power to turn any story into a romance. And you believe that? I didn't used to, he answered honestly. But being here with you, a distant clap of thunder interrupted the moment, followed by the soft sound of rain against the windows. Emma stepped back, gently aware of the dangerous territory they were entering. You should rest, she suggested. Tomorrow will be an important day. The guest room is ready, James indicated a door on the right. Although to keep up appearances we should share the master bedroom, Emma added, blushing slightly. In case any staff come in. The arrangement had been discussed clinically during the flight, but now in the intimate setting of the suite, it seemed fraught with new implications. Later, lying next to James in a huge king-size bed, Emma watched the lights of Paris dancing on the ceiling. The sound of his regular breathing indicated that he had fallen asleep, probably exhausted after the long day. She allowed herself to look at his sleeping profile, noticing how his features looked younger, more vulnerable in sleep. The man the world knew as the ruthless CEO of Bradford Technologies had completely disappeared, leaving only James, the boy who lost his parents too soon and built walls around himself to survive. "What story are we really writing here, James?" she whispered into the Parisian night, not expecting an answer. But James wasn't completely asleep. In his semi-consciousness, he registered her whispering and the warmth of her presence beside him. And for the first time in years, the nightmares that used to haunt him in Paris didn't come. In their place, there was only a sense of peace that he hadn't felt since he was a child, watching his parents dance to La Vie en Rose in that very suite. The City of Light continued its eternal dance outside, indifferent to the dramas unfolding within its historic walls. And as the night wore on, two people who had started out as CEO and assistant turned husband and wife by contract discovered that some stories have the power to rewrite themselves regardless of the most carefully laid plans. The conference room at Bradford Technologies' Paris office was silent as James presented the latest figures to European investors. Emma, sitting next to him, watched with professional admiration as he ran the meeting with his usual surgical precision. "As you can see, gentlemen, our expansion in the European market exceeded all projections last quarter," James explained, his fingers gliding over the tablet screen with confidence. Emma noticed that he was still wearing his father's watch, a detail that few knew, but which she knew was his talisman in important meetings. "Impressive, Mr. Bradford," commented Pierre Dubois, one of the main investors. "And I must say that marriage seems to have done you good. You're more," he searched for the English word, "centered." James cast a quick glance at Emma, who was maintaining her impeccable professional posture in the navy blue Dior dress he had personally chosen. "All credit to her," he replied with a smile that seemed genuinely proud. During the lunch that followed the meeting in an intimate restaurant overlooking the Seine, Emma noticed a subtle change in the dynamic between them. James seemed more relaxed occasionally, allowing his hand to rest on her back as they talked to the investors. "How did you meet?" asked Madame Dubois, the investor's wife, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Emma began to recite the rehearsed story about the art gallery in Soho, but James surprised her by intervening. "Actually," he said, his fingers finding hers on the table, "it was much simpler than that. Emma saw right through me from day one. While everyone else saw only the CEO, she saw the man behind the title." Emma's heart skipped a beat. That wasn't part of the carefully crafted script. There was a raw truth in his words that disconcerted her. After lunch, as they walked along the Pont d'Arts, James seemed lost in thought. "Are you all right?" Emma asked, genuinely concerned. "What you said last night," he replied, after a moment's hesitation. "About what story we're writing?" Emma froze. "Were you awake, semi-conscious?" he admitted, pausing to watch the boats on the Seine. "It was the first night in years that I didn't have nightmares in Paris." "James..." "No," he interrupted her, gently turning to face her. "Let me finish. This agreement, this marriage, it began as a practical solution to a business problem. But something has changed, Emma, and I'm not sure I can tell where the acting ends and the reality begins anymore." Emma felt her heart racing. "It's just Paris," she tried to rationalize. "The city has that effect on people." "It's not Paris," James took a step toward her. "It's you. It's always been you." The moment was interrupted by the ringing of his cell phone. Harrison Matthews, probably with more questions about the board meeting. James answered with obvious frustration, taking a few steps away. Emma took a moment to catch her breath, her hands shaking slightly as she leaned on the parapet of the bridge. James' words echoed in her mind, mingling with her own confused emotions. That evening, back in the suite at the Ritz, Emma found an envelope on her pillow. Inside was an old photo, James at the age of 12, smiling next to his parents in front of the Eiffel Tower. "It was the last picture we took together," James' voice sounded behind her. "A week before the accident." "Why are you showing me this?" "Because you deserve to know all my truths," he replied, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. not just the ones that serve our agreement. Emma sat down next to him, studying the photograph. Young James had the same reserved smile she knew so well, but his eyes were different, lighter, more hopeful. After the accident, he continued, I learned to see relationships as business transactions. It was safer that way. Even you, until you started dismantling every wall I built without even realizing you were doing it. The silence that followed was filled by the distant sound of music coming from the Place Vado. Emma recognized the melody La Vie en Rose again, as if Paris conspired to create perfect moments. Will you dance with me? James asked, holding out his hand. Emma accepted, allowing him to pull her close. They moved slowly to the music, each touch carrying a weight of unspoken truths. What happens when we get back to New York? She whispered against his shoulder. I don't know, James admitted honestly. But for the first time in a long time, I don't want everything to be perfectly planned. Emma lifted her face to look at him, finding in his eyes a vulnerability she had never seen before. At that moment, under the golden lights of Paris, all the masks seemed to have fallen away. What had started out as a business agreement was turning into something that no contract could predict or control. And as they danced to music that carried decades of memories, both Emma and James realized that some stories need to be rewritten to find their true ending. The return to New York brought with it a reality that neither Paris nor all the French romanticism could mask. The first board meeting after the wedding was scheduled for that morning, and Emma watched James adjust his tie in front of the master bedroom mirror, which they now shared permanently to keep up appearances. Harrison called earlier. James commented, his eyes meeting hers through the reflection. It seems there are rumors about a possible hostile takeover. Emma felt her stomach turn. During her years as an assistant, she had witnessed several attempts to take over the company, but now the situation seemed different. More personal? The Matthews? She asked, moving closer to adjust the knot of his tie, a gesture that had become natural in recent days. Probably. Sarah Matthews has been especially investigative about our relationship. The touch of Emma's hands on his neck made James pause. Since Paris, every contact between them carried a different weight and electricity that neither of them knew how to manage. Maybe we should give them something to investigate, Emma suggested, surprising them both with her boldness. Dinner at home, something more intimate that shows off her married life. James caught her hands before she could pull away. Are you suggesting we open our home to the enemy? I'm suggesting we control the narrative, she replied, her eyes fixed on his. Let me do it, James. Trust me. The vulnerability in her gaze made something inside him squirm. How did I trust Paris? The moment was interrupted by the sound of the intercom. Parker informing her that the car was ready. Emma walked away, picking up her Hermes bag, another gift from James that still made her feel like an imposter. At Bradford Technologies, Emma noticed the curious looks from the staff as she walked alongside James. To the world, they were the perfect power couple, the ruthless CEO and his sophisticated wife. No one suspected the nights they shared, stories on the terrace, the impromptu dances in the kitchen, the moments of truth that had begun in Paris and seemed to multiply every day. The council meeting was tense. Harrison Matthews kept casting inquisitive glances at Emma, who maintained her impeccable posture next to James. When they presented the figures for the European quarter, she felt genuine pride at seeing James dominate the room with his presence. Impressive, Bradford, Harrison commented at the end. Marriage seems to have done wonders for your business instincts. The double entendre was clear, and Emma felt James stiffen beside her. Before he could respond, she intervened. Actually, Mr. Matthews, we'd like to invite you and Sarah to dinner at our house next week. A more informal occasion to celebrate our recent successes. The silence that followed was broken by Harrison's predatory smile. It will be a pleasure, my dear. Later, in the private elevator leading up to the apartment, James finally let his professional mask drop. Are you sure about this? No, Emma admitted, leaning against the mirrored wall. But I've learned from the best how to turn threats into opportunities. James took a step towards her, eliminating the space between them. Emma, what's happening to us? The question hung in the air, loaded with all the unspoken truths since Paris. Emma felt her heart race as his fingers brushed her cheek, a touch as light as an unfulfilled promise. I don't know, she whispered, but for once I don't want to analyze every detail. The elevator arrived at their floor, the soft ding breaking the moment. But something had changed. An invisible line had been crossed. That evening, while Emma organized the details of dinner with the Matthews, James watched her from the kitchen door. She had removed her high heels, her hair pinned up carelessly as she consulted recipes on her tablet. "My mother used to do that," he commented softly, planning strategic dinners in the kitchen barefoot with that same concentrated look. Emma looked up, surprised not only by the comparison, but by the softness in his voice. Would she have approved all that? The deal? James approached, picking up a glass of wine abandoned on the counter. "No, but you," he paused, his eyes meeting hers. "She would have loved you." The words carried a weight that made Emma hold her breath. Somewhere between signed contracts and dancing in Paris, between board meetings and stolen moments in elevators, something had fundamentally changed. "James," she began, but he gently interrupted her. "Not tonight," he murmured. "Some truths need their own time." And so they remained in the kitchen, planning a dinner that could determine the future of the company, while silently recognizing that the biggest risk they faced didn't come from Harrison Matthews or hostile takeover attempts. The real danger lay in moments like this, when masks fell and the contract that bound them together seemed increasingly irrelevant in the face of the truths their hearts were determined to reveal. Dinner with the Matthews was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, and Emma watched the transformation of the penthouse with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The apartment, once so impersonal, now displayed subtle touches of his presence. Carefully selected photographs of Paris, strategically placed floral arrangements, and the ambient music she knew James secretly adored. "Chef Isabella has just confirmed the menu," Parker informed her, consulting her tablet. "And the sommelier has selected the wines according to your instructions." Emma nodded, adjusting a picture frame that showed her and James on the balcony of the Ritz. The photo captured a genuine moment, him whispering something in her ear, while she smiled, the last rays of the Parisian sun creating a golden halo around them. "Emma," James' voice surprised her. He had arrived early from the office, something of a rarity. "We need to talk before they arrive." She followed him into the office, noticing how tense he seemed. "Did something happen?" "Rachel found out something about Harrison." James closed the door behind them. "He's been meeting secretly with Chinese investors. We believe he's planning a hostile sale, not just an acquisition." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "The company your parents built?" "Exactly." James approached the window, his silhouette jagged against the Manhattan skyline. "And our marriage, ironically, may be the only thing standing in the way of that now." Emma felt the weight of that statement. What had begun as a business arrangement had inadvertently become a fortress protecting the Bradford family legacy. "That's why Sarah has been so investigative," she concluded. "They're looking for holes in our history." "Yes." James turned to her, his eyes carrying an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Emma, if they find out the truth about us." "They won't," she interrupted him, stepping closer. "James, look at me. What started out as a contract, it's not just that anymore, is it?" The silence that followed was deafening. James raised his hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her cheek. "No," he finally admitted. "It's not." The sound of the doorbell brought them back to reality. The Matthews had arrived early, an obvious tactic to catch them off guard. Dinner unfolded like a game of chess, each move carefully calculated. Sarah Matthews, elegant in her Chanel dress, kept asking seemingly innocent questions about the wedding. "So, Emma darling," she smiled over a glass of wine, "how was your honeymoon in Paris? The Ritz must have been special." "Very," Emma replied with a serene smile. "Especially since James finally showed me all his parents' favorite places. That photo of them in the presidential suite." She reached for James' hand on the table, a gesture that seemed surprisingly natural, "made me understand so much about him." James squeezed her fingers gently, and Emma realized that she was no longer acting. Every word was true, every gesture sincere. "Fascinating," Harrison commented, his calculating eyes studying the interaction. "You know, James, many were surprised by your sudden marriage. But seeing the two of you together," he paused theatrically, "almost makes me believe in fate." "Almost?" James raised an eyebrow, his voice carrying a tone of defiance. "Well, in our world, things are rarely what they seem, are they?" Harrison smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Business marriages. Everything could be a question of strategy." Emma felt James stiffen beside her, but before he could reply, she stood up gracefully. "Why don't we have coffee on the terrace? The view of the sunset is spectacular." On the balcony, while Sarah complimented the decor, Emma noticed Harrison approaching James in a more secluded corner. She maintained her strategic position close enough to hear the conversation. "Your wife is lovely, Bradford," Harrison commented quietly. "It would be a shame if something compromising about your marriage came to light during the next council meeting." "Are you threatening me, Matthews?" "Just commenting that secrets have a peculiar way of revealing themselves at the most inopportune moments." Emma chose that moment to move closer, sliding naturally into James' arms. "Love, would you show Mr. Matthews that special bottle of cognac we brought back from Paris, the one from the same vintage that your parents bought on their honeymoon?" The move was perfect, intimate enough to seem natural, specific enough to prove detailed knowledge of the Bradford family history. Harrison couldn't hide his momentary frustration. After the Matthews left, Emma found James in the library, an untouched shot of whiskey in his hands. "They suspect," he said without turning around. "But they can't prove anything." Emma approached, gently removing the glass from his hands. "And more importantly, they can't manufacture something that doesn't exist." "What do you mean that maybe?" She hesitated, gathering her courage. "Maybe what started out as a lie has turned into something real enough to protect us." James stared at her longingly, as if trying to decipher a particularly complex puzzle. "Emma, not tonight." She repeated the words he had used a few days earlier. "Some truths need their own time, remember?" He nodded, a small smile appearing on his lips. And as the night advanced over Manhattan, they both realized that the greatest protection against Harrison's threats was not in contracts or business strategies, but in the moments of truth they had built together, one day at a time, since that first dance in Paris. A month after the dinner with the Matthews, the routine in the Bradford apartment had found its own rhythm. Emma would wake up before dawn to make coffee, not because she needed to, but because she loved the moment when James emerged from his bedroom, still drowsy, attracted by the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. On that particular morning, however, she found the kitchen already occupied. James was standing by the window, still in his jogging clothes, a tense expression on his face as he spoke on the phone. "I understand," he said, his voice controlled, but with a note of concern that Emma recognized instantly. "Keep me posted, Rachel." "What happened?" Emma asked as soon as he hung up, already moving to prepare the coffee, just the way he liked it, strong, unsweetened, with a touch of cream. Harrison managed to schedule an extraordinary board meeting for next week. James accepted the cup she offered, his fingers brushing hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Rachel found out that he has documents about us." Emma felt her stomach turn. "What kind of documents?" "Records from your old apartment in Queens, dates from when you started working at the company, photos of you from before." He paused, running his hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "He's building a case to prove that our marriage is a fraud." "But it's not," Emma said softly, surprising them both with the firmness in her voice. "Not anymore." James looked up at her, a rare vulnerability in his gaze. "Emma." The moment was interrupted by the sound of the elevator Parker arriving with the day's agenda. Emma pulled away, her heart pounding wildly, but James stopped her gently by the wrist. "Have dinner with me tonight?" he asked, his voice low and intense. "Just the two of us. No masks, no pretenses." Emma nodded, unable to find words for the raw emotion in his eyes. The day dragged on with palpable tension at Bradford Technologies. Emma could feel the curious glances of the staff, especially after Harrison Matthews was seen coming in and out of the legal department several times. "He's trying to co-opt some in-house lawyers," Rachel informed her over a quick lunch in her office. "But the majority are on our side. They see how you've changed, James. How the two of you together have turned the company into something more than numbers on spreadsheets." Emma played with her wedding ring, no longer just a stage prop, but a symbol of something that had grown organically between her and James. "How do we protect what we've built?" Rachel smiled enigmatically. "Sometimes the best defense is the truth." When Emma returned to the apartment that evening, she found it transformed. Candles softly illuminated the room, and the scent of something delicious came from the kitchen. James was standing by the piano, an instrument she had never seen him play. "I didn't know you played," she commented, coming closer. "My mother taught me," he replied, his fingers gliding smoothly over the keys. "I stopped after the accident, but recently," he hesitated, "I've been thinking about starting again." "Why?" "Because you make me want to rediscover parts of myself that I thought were lost forever." The raw honesty in his words made Emma hold her breath. James stood up from the piano, reducing the distance between them with deliberate steps. "Will you dance with me?" he asked, holding out his hand. "No music this time. Just us." Emma accepted, allowing him to pull her close. They moved slowly, lulled only by the sound of the city outside and their synchronized breathing. "Harrison may have papers," James murmured against her hair, "but he doesn't have that. He doesn't have the real moments, the truths we've built together." "And what are those truths, James?" Emma pulled away slightly to look into his eyes. "That you've changed everything," he admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "That what started out as a contract turned into the most real thing I've ever had in my life. That the sound of Emma's cell phone cut the moment short. It was Rachel, her voice urgent. "Harrison called the board meeting for tomorrow. He won't wait a week." James, who could hear the conversation due to his proximity, stiffened visibly. But before he could move away, Emma held his face between her hands. "No," she said firmly. "Let's not let Harrison Matthews dictate our moments. Finish what you were going to say." James covered her hands with his eyes revealing a decision being made. "That I love you," he added simply. "Not as part of an agreement, not as a business strategy. I love you in a way that no contract could predict or control." Emma felt tears burn her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "And it's this truth of ours that Harrison will never be able to document or invalidate." They kissed, then not as in the carefully staged photos or social events, but with a truth that had grown silently between board meetings and shared breakfasts, between dances in Paris in late-night confidences. The board meeting awaited them the next morning, but at that moment, dancing without music in their Manhattan apartment, James and Emma knew they had found something more valuable than any corporate empire, a truth that no document could dispute, a love that had blossomed between the lines of a business contract. The boardroom on the 45th floor of Bradford Technologies vibrated with an almost palpable tension that morning. Emma, sitting next to James, maintained her elegant posture in the navy blue Armani dress he had chosen for her in Paris. Their hands, intertwined under the table, shared a silent strength that no document could capture. Harrison Matthews entered the room with a predatory smile, carrying a thick briefcase that he deposited dramatically on the table. "Gentlemen of the board," he began, his voice distilling false concern, "I'm afraid I've discovered something deeply disturbing about our CEO and his recent marriage." James felt Emma squeeze his hand, lightly, an almost imperceptible gesture of support. He kept his expression neutral, years of difficult negotiations having taught him to mask his emotions. "Please, Harrison," Catherine Whitman interrupted, her voice carrying decades of boardroom experience. "Get to the point." "With pleasure." Harrison opened his briefcase, spreading out photographs and documents. "I have proof here that the Bradford marriage is an elaborate sham designed to keep James in control of the company. Emma Santos, or should I say Maria Santos, was just an ordinary employee until a few weeks before the wedding." A murmur ran through the room. Emma kept her eyes fixed on the photographs, images of her leaving her old apartment in Queens, records of her work visa, her old Brazilian identity. "And that proves what exactly?" Rachel Bennett's voice cut through the hubbub like a sharp blade. She stood up, walking to the front of the room with her own folder. "That Emma has a story, that she's worked hard to get where she is, or are you suggesting that only people born into a cradle of gold can be part of this company?" Harrison looked momentarily baffled. "The timing of the wedding, it's perfectly explainable," Rachel interrupted him, distributing her own documents. "I have here records of substantial donations made by Bradford Technologies to social projects in Brazil over the last 5 years. Projects specifically chosen by Emma when she was still executive assistant, demonstrating not only her professional competence, but her character and values aligned with those of the company." James watched Emma with surprise. He knew about the donations, of course, but he didn't know that she had selected the projects. Once again, she surprised him with her depth and integrity. "That still doesn't explain." Harrison tried again, but this time it was James who stood up. "Enough." His voice, although calm, carried an authority that silenced the room. "Do you want truths, Harrison? Here's one. Yes, our marriage began as an agreement. A contract drawn up to satisfy an outdated clause that you and your allies intended to use against me." Emma felt her heart race. This wasn't the plan they had discussed, but there was something liberating in James' blunt honesty. But you know what happened? James continued, his eyes meeting Emma's with an intensity that made the whole room disappear. It turned out that in the midst of contracts and clauses, I found something that no legal document could have predicted. I found a woman who saw beyond the CEO, beyond the Bradford name, beyond the masks I'd learned to wear since losing my parents. "James," Emma whispered, unshed tears glistening in her eyes. "Emma taught me that there are things more valuable than controlling shares," he continued, his voice softer. "She brought music back to our home. She brought purpose to our philanthropic endeavors. She brought humanity back to this company that my parents built not just with numbers, but with heart." Catherine Whitman stood up slowly, an understanding smile on her wrinkled face. "Harrison, dear, I think you've just proved exactly the opposite of what you intended." "What do you mean?" Harrison asked, his confidence visibly shaken. "You brought us proof of a calculated beginning, but what we see here today," she gestured to James and Emma, "is something no contract could ever manufacture. It's love, pure and simple. And if there's one thing I've learned in 50 years of business, it's that true love has a peculiar way of being born in the most unlikely places." The silence that followed was broken by the soft sound of applause initiated by Rachel and quickly followed by the rest of the board. Harrison Matthews sank into his chair, defeated not by documents or strategies, but by the simplest and most powerful truth of all. Later, alone in James' office, Emma finally let the tears fall. "You risked everything." "No," James interrupted her, gently pulling her into his arms. "I just said out loud what we've known for a long time. That some truths are stronger than any lie, that some loves transcend their imperfect beginnings." Emma lifted her face to look at him, seeing in his eyes the reflection of all the transformations they had experienced together. "And now, James smiled, that rare, genuine smile she had learned to love. "I think it's time we rewrote our contract. Not as CEO and employee, not as a business agreement, but as two people who have found love in the tangles of fate." And there in the same office where it had all begun, they began to write a new chapter, not on letterhead or legal documents, but in the synchronized beats of their hearts. A week after the dramatic board meeting, Emma found James in the apartment library organizing old family photographs. It was late at night, and the city shone through the windows like a sea of earthly stars. "I found this," he said without turning around, holding up a yellowed photograph. "It's from the day my parents opened the first Bradford Technologies office. It was just a small room in the center, but for them it represented a dream come true." Emma approached, looking at the smiling young couple in the photo. James' mother had the same piercing eyes as her son, while his father flashed that strange smile she knew so well. "They'd be proud of the man you've become," she said softly, taking a seat next to him on the leather sofa. "Even after almost using our marriage as a business transaction," James asked, a touch of bitterness in his voice. "Especially since you had the courage to admit the truth and fight for what really matters," Emma replied, interlacing her fingers with his. "Did you know that Harrison resigned from the council this morning?" James nodded. "Rachel informed me. Apparently his public exposure wasn't well received by the other shareholders. But that's not what concerns me now." "What is it then?" "Our original contract." He stood up, walking over to his desk. 2 years, $5 million. It seems so cold and inadequate now. Emma felt her heart race. "James, let me finish," he returned with an envelope in his hands. "I spent the week rewriting something. Not a contract, but a promise." He opened the envelope and took out a simple document without the official Bradford Technologies letterhead. Emma recognized his elegant handwriting, usually reserved for signatures on important documents. "I, James Bradford," he began to read, "promise to love Emma Santos, not for 2 years, but for all the days of my life. I promise to cherish not just her presence in my company, but her essence in my soul. I promise to share not just a bank account, but every dream, every fear, every moment of joy and sorrow." Emma felt tears burn her eyes as James continued. "In exchange, I'm not offering $5 million, but every beat of my heart, every breath, every moment of a future that I want to build alongside you. This is not a business transaction, but a declaration of eternal love." "James," Emma whispered, her voice laced with emotion. "I'm not finished yet," he smiled softly. "There's one last clause." And because some stories deserve a new beginning, I propose we renew our vows not in an elaborate ceremony to impress the council, but in an intimate celebration of the true love we find in each other. Emma stood up, walking over to him with trembling steps. "We're next month in the little chapel where my parents got married in Hampshire. Just as some really important people and all the truths we've built together." "Yes," she replied simply, "because some truths need no elaboration." James pulled her into his arms, and they danced slowly to the sound of the city outside. It was a La Vie en Rose playing in Paris, but it had its own melody, the symphony of two hearts finding their perfect rhythm. "Do you know what else I found today?" James asked after a moment, leading her to an old wooden box on his desk. "My mother's diary. She wrote something the day before the accident that only now makes complete sense." He opened the diary to a marked page, and Emma recognized the delicate handwriting. True success in business is not measured only by numbers on a spreadsheet, but by the ability to keep your heart open even when the business world demands that you close it. James will learn that one day when he meets someone who reminds him that love and business don't have to be mutually exclusive. Emma traced the words with gentle fingers, feeling the weight of the prophecy come true. She knew that "I'd need someone like you." "Yes, I think she did." James smiled, that rare smile that was now appearing more frequently. Just as she knew that the true legacy of Bradford Technologies is not in contracts or acquisitions, but in the ability to build bridges between hearts. That night, while Manhattan slept its restless sleep, James and Emma stayed awake, planning not corporate strategies, but a future built on the most solid foundations. There are truth, trust, and unconditional love. And somewhere, perhaps in the corridors of time, or in the stars shining over the city, James' parents smiled, knowing that their son had finally found the perfect balance between the empire he inherited and the love he won. The small chapel in Hampshire gleamed in the soft autumn sunshine. Emma stood in front of the antique mirror in the dressing room, her fingers delicately tracing the diamond necklace that had once belonged to James' mother. The dress she had chosen for the renewal of vows was simple and elegant, a Vera Wang model in a champagne shade that perfectly captured the essence of the moment, not a display of power or status, but a celebration of true love. "Are you ready?" Rachel asked softly, entering the room. Over the last few months, the lawyer had become more than a professional ally. She was a true friend. "Almost," Emma replied, adjusting a lock of her hair. "Is James here yet?" "He's in the chapel office, apparently rewriting his vows for the 10th time." Rachel smiled. "I've never seen him so nervous." Emma felt her heart race. This wedding was different from the first. There were no contracts to fulfill, no corporate expectations to meet. It was just her and James, choosing each other with total freedom and truth. Outside the chapel, the guests began to arrive. Unlike the pompous ceremony in New York this time, it was just the really important people, a few loyal board members, close friends, and a special surprise that Emma had secretly organized. "Emma," a familiar voice made her turn around. Her parents were standing in the doorway, her mother with tears in her eyes, and her father trying to keep his composure. "Mom, Daddy," Emma ran into his arms. James had insisted on sending the private jet to pick them up in Brazil, but it kept the surprise until the last moment. "Your husband," her father began, his voice breaking, "told us everything. About how it started, about how it turned into something real, and about how you saved not only his company, but his heart," her mother added, holding her daughter's hands. "We're so proud, my little one." The moment was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Parker now, not just an assistant, but a close friend. "It's time." The music that began to play was not the traditional wedding march, but La Vie en Rose, a special recording James had commissioned from a string quartet. Emma walked down the aisle of the chapel, not with the choreographed precision of the first ceremony, but with the genuine emotion of a woman completely in love. James was waiting for her at the altar, and his expression at the sight of her made the whole journey from that first agreement in his office worthwhile. His eyes, normally so controlled, glistened with restrained tears. "Emma," he began his vows, his voice strong despite the emotion. "When you came into my life, I was a man who believed that success could be measured in numbers and power. You taught me that true wealth lies in the moments we share, in the truths we discover together, in the love that has grown between the lines of a business contract." Emma felt tears run down her cheeks as he continued. I promise to spend the rest of my life not just being your husband, but being the man you always knew I could be. I promise to dance with you in the kitchen, listen to Brazilian music late into the night, and never again confuse commercial value with heart value." When it was her turn, Emma took a deep breath, finding strength in the love she saw in his eyes. "James, our beginning may not have been a traditional fairy tale, but our story is more powerful because we chose to turn an agreement into true love. I promise to remain not only your partner in life, but your anchor in times of storm, your light in times of doubt, in your home, anywhere in the world." The reception that followed was held in the gardens of the estate that had once belonged to James' parents. Under the soft lights hanging between the century-old trees, the guests celebrated not just a wedding, but a story of transformation and redemption. Catherine Whitman, watching the couple dance under the stars, commented to Rachel, "You know, in 50 years in the corporate world, I've never seen anything like this. A contract that turned into a love story worthy of the best novels." Later, when most of the guests have left, James found Emma sitting on the old swing in the garden gazing at the moon. Without saying a word, he joined her, and together they watched the night in comfortable silence. "I found something in my father's study today," he finally said, pulling an envelope out of his pocket. "It's a letter he wrote from me to be delivered on my wedding day, my real wedding as he specified." Emma squeezed his hand as he read it. "My son, when you meet someone who makes your heart dance, even in the most serious moments, who brings music to your quietest days, and who sees beyond the masks the business world forces us to wear, don't let that person slip away. True success lies not in building empires, but in building a life rich in love and purpose. Your mother taught me that, and I hope you find someone who will do the same for you." James folded the letter carefully, keeping it close to his heart. "He was right, you know, about everything." Emma smiled, leaning back on his shoulder. "And now," James replied, kissing her forehead softly, "we're going to write our own story one day at a time. No contracts, no clauses, just the two of us, and all the truths we have yet to discover together." And there, under the starry Hampshire sky, James and Emma Bradford began the next chapter of their lives, not as CEO, an assistant, not as parties to a business agreement, but as two souls who had found in the most unlikely place the kind of love that transcends any contract and defies any business logic. It was the beginning of a new story, one that promised to be even more extraordinary than the one that had brought them there.